It's really a pleasure for me to be participating in this seminar. The title, as you have there on the screen, is Negotiating Female Victimization and Trauma in Magdalene Noir Narratives. Oops, I can't pass my PowerPoint. Okay, I'll click, yeah, right. So this is just a project I'm part of, and I'm conducting research on the Magdalene Laundries as well in the context of the project Queer Practices of Use and Embodiment in Post 9/11 Narratives in English. So I wanted to briefly mention that, yeah. And well, in recent decades, writers, academics, and critical commentators inside and outside Ireland have tried to determine the features that distinguish the so-called Emerald Noir. Many of them agree that it's the result of the rapid growth of Ireland's cultural order in the post-Troubles and post-Celtic Tiger era, which, for example, for Val McDermid, yeah, she considers this a period that provided Irish writers a challenge of material. For David Clarke, Emerald Noir focuses on the national component of Irish crime fiction, and he claims that these narratives have been, characteristically inclined to portray crime as an essential issue with an essentially Irish context, transcending former restrictions imposed by the parameters of the genre by means of a more localized approach to offense and victimization. This trend reveals, in Clarke's own words, quote, that the relationship between the individual and the society or authority which represents this society. Indeed, the books of this genre published in Ireland lately expose many of the paradoxes underlying the country's status quo, and while offering no solution to the pervasive social contradictions, they pose interesting questions not only about the criminal transgression of social boundaries, but also about their role in defining the clear-cut categories of the social axis. So, as Andrew Kincaid puts it, and the quote you have there, hardboiled fiction allows one to move through the murky structures that bind us together. Also, in his study, Irish crime fiction, Brian Cleave has remarked that for some contemporary authors, the Irish establishment plays a significant role in the representation of evil, in the sense that frequently in these narratives, quote, violence is ascribed to an individual sociopath and more to pathological institutions, which in turn reflect wider pathologies of the society in whose name they act. Hence, what stems from this thematic tendency is an insistence on the joint responsibility of the community in perpetuating such pathologies. According to Finch and O'Toole, many Irish writers stress the shock that arises not simply when details of criminal activities are unveiled, but most importantly when it becomes apparent that those crimes were sustained by a widespread social concurrence and subsequently a total indifference to them. For him, for O'Toole, quote, the problem posed by Irish crime is not, as in the classic detective story, the acquisition of knowledge, but the assumption of collective ignorance. In fact, John Banville himself, one of the leading names in crime fictions in Ireland, has consistently denounced the social crime whereby a greater part of the Irish society decided to ignore the details of the infamous practices of institutionalization in the country through assertions like, and that's the quote you have here, everybody knew about child abuse, everybody knew about these appalling orphanages, these terrible convents, these atrocious so-called industrial schools, where children were sent to be tormented and raped, I mean, everybody knew. Now, for over 3 decades, the historical trauma of Ireland's architecture of containment, specifically the Magdalene Laundries and the mother and baby homes, has shifted from being a whispered secret to becoming a central theme in Irish cultural productions. While memoirs and documentaries were the first to break the silence, a new wave of cultural products has adopted the tropes of crime fiction and the Gothic to address these institutional wrongdoings. Taken together, they constitute what I would call Magdalene Noir narratives, as I believe that they avail of the formulas of the genre to interrogate the structural dimension of evil, as well as the degree of criminality that the artefacts of the Irish Catholic Church and the state perpetrated upon young, pregnant, unmarried girls and other deviant women. Unlike traditional historical fiction, these texts use the noir aesthetics, characterized, as you know, by moral ambiguity, systemic corruption, and a pervasive sense of fear and dread, to mirror the lived experience of the women confined in these institutions. So in this seminar today, I will explore John Banville's Christine Falls and Even the Dead, alongside Joe Murtagh's The Woman in the Wall, which exemplify how the conventions of the detective novels and the psychological thriller are suited to expose the systemic abuse within Magdalene Laundries and modern baby homes. My argument is that by framing these institutional victimization, as a crime in the literary and also in the literary sense, Banville and Murtagh challenged the state's historical discourse of shared shame, repositioning the events as criminal acts per se. I also contend that these texts offer new ways of critically thinking about the possibility of reparation of the trauma and social justice that lay open in the most contemporary social order of Ireland. Now, it's formulaic in the noir genre to be preoccupied with the underbelly of society, which in the context of the text that will be explored was not found in the criminal underworld, but within the sacred walls of many religious institutions. The criminality explored in these texts is not individual, but somehow structural, as they link the moral policing of women's bodies to a wider network of power, and they illustrate how the social order of the mid and late 20th century was built on the social and literal disappearance of deviant women. To understand Magdalene Noir, we must remember that what James Smith termed architecture of containment meant that, as you know, throughout much of the 20th century, the Irish state delegated its social welfare responsibilities to the Catholic Church, creating a network of industrial schools, Magdalene Laundries, and modern baby homes. These institutions were not religious retreats, but total carceral spaces designed to detain those who challenged the moral and social status quo, primarily, as you know, fallen women and their illegitimate children. The systematic nature of these abuses was not the result of a few bad actors, but a symbiotic relationship between secular and religious authorities. The crime was often the theft of a child and the concealment of a death. In historical reality, the mother and baby homes oversaw a system of forced adoptions, often to wealthy Catholic families in the United States, in exchange for donations. The high mortality rates in institutions like Tuam, as you know, highlight a profound structural dimension of evil. The state's failure to supervise these homes, combined with the church obsession with secrecy, created a legal vacuum where human rights were totally non-existent. Another major problem around the Magdalene Laundries and modern baby homes scandals refers to the fact that the trauma did not end when the last laundry closed in 1996. Many of the survivors face, unfortunately, a double silence. The physical walls of the institution and the social walls of a community that prefer to somehow look away. And this is precisely what the noir genre seeks to dismantle. And in the case of Murtagh's piece, the symbol of the wall acquires a strong relevance, as we will see in a minute. By framing these historical facts as unresolved criminal investigations, contemporary noir narratives challenge the official state narrative of collective responsibility, and they refocus on the specific documented criminality of institutional power. Now, John Banville, writing under the pseudonym of Benjamin Black, created the character of Quirk, who is a misanthropic, alcoholic, forensic pathologist who works in the fictional Holy Family Hospital in Dublin. The series began with Christine Falls in 2006. Now we are commemorating the 20th anniversary of this publication, and it extended through titles like The Silver Swan, Elegy for April, Holy Orders, up to The Lockup, and most recently, The Drowned. Now, John Banville thoughtfully set the novels in 1950s Dublin, where the Catholic Church had a huge social power intertwined with the state. So we can say that he uses Quirk to perform some kind of a literal and figurative also autopsy on Irish society, and I love this metaphor. As a reviewer of the novels observed, the pathologist anatomizes the Ireland of the 50s as he does its victim. The series mobilizes noir aesthetics not to naturalize women's victimization, the disposability of their bodies, actually their corpses, or the trauma, but rather to expose how it can all be structurally produced. In a context of religious norms, unmarried mothers, illegitimate children, and Magdalene Laundries exemplify how women were treated as morally vulnerable and socially subservient. In Banville's hands, noir becomes not simply a stylistic mode, but an instrument of cultural critique. His stories portrayed violence against women not as an act of individual wrongdoing, but as a part of a larger patriarchal and post-nationalist system of disposability, and ultimately it leads to trauma. Banville repeatedly returns to different forms of gender violence, the concealment of violence, the justification of violence, the erasure of violence, and he inscribes these crimes in dialogue with history, with morality, and with the possibility or impossibility of justice. The first stance that gives Banville's work a really unique force in Magdalene Noir lies precisely in its retrospective perspective. He's writing in the 21st century about the mid-20th century, but the author is not simply writing historical crime fiction, he is performing this somehow literary forensics on a national trauma. The novels, I think, anticipate the late 20th century revelations because we as readers know already what lies ahead in Irish history, like the Ryan reports, the Murphy reports, the mass graves at Tuam, and the testimonies of the survivors of the Magdalene Laundries. So the crimes that Quirk investigates that, along the series many crimes like infant trafficking, clerical abuse, institutional corruption, incest, etc., are the specific ones of a chapter of Irish history that was silenced for half a century. So I think crime fiction comes very useful for the discussion of these scandals and the questioning, as William Mayer and Ian Campbell Rose note, quote, of whether crimes have been committed, what practices constitute crime, the extent to which crimes can be punished, and ultimately the failure of the state and social institutions to protect citizens from harm. The genre has proved appropriate, quote again, for bringing light of crimes long concealed, sometimes as willful acts of national amnesia. In exposing unwelcome truths about the nation today, crime writers have necessarily confronted its past. My analysis concentrates on Christine Falls and Even the Dead. The first one, Christine Falls, introduces Quirk's troubled life as the adopted son of a renowned Catholic magistrate whose name is Garrett Griffin. But when Quirk becomes the state's pathologist, he also remains haunted by his childhood experiences as an orphan in Carriclea Industrial School. Quirk gets obsessed with the mysterious death of a young girl, Christine Falls, as he gradually unravels the details of the case with the help of Detective Inspector Haggard, and after that, a transatlantic and institutional network of clandestine adoption becomes evident. The web, this network, comprises Magdalene Laundries and mother and baby homes in Dublin and orphanages and seminaries in Boston, all managed by the Catholic clergy and sponsored by the upper class society in both countries. So the central crime is not simply the death of a woman, but the systemic conspiracy to disappear her illegitimate pregnancy and its traces. When Quirk discovers that his own family is complicit in the baby trafficking business, the noir moves from a detective trope to a devastating critique of structural evil. So also, besides the dark elements in the book, actually in the whole series, I think the dark elements function through topographical symbolism. I mean, the foggy streets of Dublin and the clinical coldness of the morgue somehow represent the turbulences around the institutional abuse. So it's kind of a grim allegory of the buried identities and the suppressed grief of those that are discarded by a confessional state. Banville's narrative argues that the church did not act in isolation. It operated through the connivance also of, the medical profession and the state. Actually, it is Quirk's adoptive father who, sorry for the spoiler, who turns out to be the biological father of Christine's child. And also Quirk's adoptive brother, the famous gynecologist Malachi Griffin, is the one who falsifies Christine's death records. So Quirk tries very hard to elucidate the circumstances of Christine's fatal childbirth and the whereabouts of her baby. And in the process, he encounters first Dolly Moran. She is the matron who attended Christine's childbirth at her house and later brought the baby to the mother and baby home in order to be adopted. Dolly Moran, is the one who eventually confesses the whole thing to Quirk, puts him in the picture of the whole procedure. And she also tells the pathology a story in a very, very confessional tone, but that somehow implicates herself. And that's the quote you have there. I knew a girl had a baby like that, she said, looking at nothing. They took it off her, put it in an orphanage. She found out where. She used to go up there every day and stand outside the playground, looking in through the railings to see if she could recognize her boy. Among the others, for years and years she did that, until she heard he'd been moved long before. Secondly, when Dolly is mysteriously, again another spoiler, murdered after her revelation, and again we have another disposable corpse of a woman, Quirk visits the Mother of Mercy Laundry in Inchicore in Dublin, where the nun in charge, Sister Dominic, denies cynically having heard of Christian Falls or her baby because she says this is a laundry, not a lying hospital. There, in the laundry, the pathologist also accidentally meets Maisie, a Magdalene in the institution who is heavily pregnant and rather anguished at the possibility of having her baby stolen. And that's the quote you have there, the conversation between Quirk and Maisie. Would they take your baby from you? Quirk said. Maisie gave another snort. Wouldn't they have? I'll run away, so I will. I have money saved. He tried to picture her making her desperate escape, but all he could conjure were images of Victorian melodrama. The reality would be the mailboat and a rented room down a back street in some anonymous English city. If she got that far, which he very much doubted, most likely she would not get beyond the gates of this place. Wait, he said urgently. What's wrong? Are you frightened? You'd be frightened, she said darkly, if you knew then crowd. Look, there's no one, Quirk said. There's always somebody, she said simply. The passage reveals how black Banville uses the noir aesthetics to expose the systemic trauma rooted in the nation's history of coercive confinement of Magdalene women. And with that mysterious "there's always somebody," he comments on how the hierarchy and social elites orchestrated not only their control, but also the trade of illegitimate infants. So trauma is depicted not simply as a collection of individual tragedies, but somehow as a kind of pathogenic secrecy that permeated the social fabric of Ireland at that time. The state's complicity ensures that the suffering of marginalized women remains a hidden structural necessity. But when the action moves from Dublin to Boston, Quirk finds out about the irregular funding of orphanages, whose details are confirmed by Sister Anselm, a nun in one of the orphanages that, after years of complicit participation, eventually resents the smuggling of babies from Ireland. And she admits to Quirk, that's the quote, "They care nothing for the children. Oh, they think they do, but they don't. Their only interest is see them grow up and take their place in the structure they've devised. When the children are old enough, they're put into seminaries and convents, whether they like it or not. It's a machine for making priests and nuns." The hegemonic matrix required the disappearance of fallen women and their illegitimate offspring to maintain the illusion of a holy Ireland. But Banville's retrospective positioning allows him to expose how this religious, nationalist, and cultural ethos was used to justify these atrocities, these crimes. And at the end of the novel, Quirk's father admits to him the reason for his involvement in the illegal adoptions, and that's the quote. "Some people are not meant to have children, some people haven't the right." And Quirk asks, "And who decides?" So the judge answers, "We do. Women in the tenements of Dublin and Cork bearing 17, 18 children in as many years, what sort of a life would those youngsters face? Aren't they better off out here with families who can take care of them, cherish them? Answer me that." And then Quirk says, "So you're the judge and the jury, you God himself." This dialogue reveals Banville's critique of how the ethical and legal order could be manipulated according to the interests and directions of the church hierarchy and its social allies, thus violating its own moral principles of communal love, care, piety, and solidarity, supposedly. The crime is not an aberration of the system, but it's the system's primary function. In Even the Dead, the continuum of victimization becomes clear too. Quirk and Detective Hackett conduct an investigation after the body of a civil servant in the Department of Health, Leo Corliss, is found inside a burned car in Phoenix Park. Their inquiries reveal that the victim was gathering statistics regarding mother and child issues that would somehow unmask the regular infringement of the law in this office of the government. Simultaneously, Quirk's daughter, Phoebe, befriends Corliss's girlfriend, whose name is Lisa Smith, who is confined to Magdalene Laundry shortly after her family discovers that she is pregnant out of wedlock. So when Phoebe is planning to visit the institution to ask the police also to release her friend, she thinks that the charge isn't above the law, very naively. But it is then when Quirk warns her that, and that's the quote you have there, there's no point in going up to the laundry. They'll deny everything. They'll say they never heard of Lisa Smith. The guards won't do anything. Places like that laundry are protected. There is an invisible fence around them that you won't break through. What they eventually find out is that the girl's father, Costigan, a respected member of a Catholic association and a thug at the service of powerful families, was actually responsible for Corliss's murder and also had tried to obtain economic benefits from consigning his own daughter to the Magdalene Laundry and all the under-the-counter adoption of the illegitimate baby. So both the re-emergence of this business of the laundries and the trafficking of the babies some years after the introduction in the first book in Christian Falls, and the emphasis on how its orbit affected women from different social classes. We have Christine Falls, we have Dolly Moran, we have Macy, but also we have Costigan's daughter. All this demonstrates the author's insistence on the ubiquitous proportions of the whole system. For these women, danger, victimization, and trauma are not only physical, but also legal, moral, and existential. Being unmarried, pregnant, socially isolated, potentially silenced by institutional power, The missing woman, the church cover-ups, and the social stigma all reinforce their disposability and their trauma. For them, pregnancy outside wedlock and means actually marginalization, danger, erasure. Nevertheless, I also want to highlight here today how in these narratives, Black Banville also claims for new ways of thinking, resisting and dismantling the traditional logics of gender violence and Magdalene trauma. Firstly, once he knows all the details of the Christine Falls case, Quirk experiences a transformation in his relation to the corpses he examines, and that's the quote you have there. In the dissecting rooms of the bodies in the dissecting room, the bodies used to seem to him the remains of sacrificial victims, spent and inert after the frightful bloody ceremony of their souls leaving. But he would never again view a cadaver in that lurid light. Suddenly for him, death had lost its terrifying glamour and become just another of the mundane business of life, although its last. His role as a pathologist and investigator is mediated through his encounters with Magdalene women's trauma, and he is haunted by these women, unable to fully separate his profession from his ethical responsibility. Now, Joe Marta's thriller, The Woman in the Wall, is a BBC drama where trauma is represented as another haunting force that manifests through both psychological fracturing and physical symptoms. The protagonist, Lorna Brady, wakes up to discover an unknown body in her home. She suffers from chronic sleepwalking and dissociative blackouts, which serve as manifestations of her repressed memories from her time in a Magdalene laundry. Murtagh uses Gothic horror elements, like, for example, there's lots of disembodied wails, there's lots of sightings, we have the wall itself, to represent how Magdalene women's victimization, abuse, and the forced separation from their children refuse to remain buried. This portrayal extends beyond the individual to the collective, showing how a whole community is scarred, damaged by the systemic institutional abuse and a culture of silence, since in the fictional town of Kilkenore in County Mayo, the community are constituted by a number also of former inmates of the Magdalene Laundries who live there. Unlike Banville's procedural and detective story approach, The Woman in the Wall adopts the aesthetics of the psychological thriller. Lorna suffers from extreme sleepwalking, which is a physical manifestation of the repressed trauma from her time in the laundry when she was young. The noir here is mostly internal, but the wall in the title is both a physical structure that contains the corpse of Aoife Cassidy. Aoife is the former nun who used to smuggle the babies, and Lorna keeps hidden her corpse in her house behind the wall. And this is both a psychological barrier for both herself and also for the dead woman. The text demonstrates how the institutional wrongdoings result in an ongoing trauma that disrupts the linear perception of time. Because Lorna cannot distinguish between the past and the present. So it suggests that for survivors, the effects of institutionalization and the illegal trafficking of babies continue to exist within their bodies and also, most importantly, within their minds. The main plot driver is Lorna's quest to find her stolen daughter, her name is Agnes. And it turns when Lorna discovers that the death certificate that she received was actually falsified. And this is, as you know, a typical tactic used by religious institutions to prevent mothers from ever reuniting with their children. However, for me, the major catalyst for the present day investigation that is carried out jointly by the local Garda and by Detective Coleman Akandi, is the murder of Father Percy, a priest who oversaw the laundries. He represents the clerical figures who facilitated the incarceration of the women, highlighting the motive that many survivors had for seeking retribution. The transition, I think, from previous representations, which are somehow more realist, if you want, like, previous cultural products like the Magdalene Laundries or many other documentaries or memoirs, etc., to what we have here, which is a gothic horror production. Yeah, I think this marks somehow a transformation, like a shift. Yeah. So we're going from documenting or being more realist in representing what happened, to here dramatize to how it feels to live with the aftermath of the trauma. Yeah, I think this is one of the essential pieces, one of the essential narratives that engages the reader in the horror. Yeah. Like Banville's series, in this drama, we find a culture of silence, yeah, and the systematic institutional abuse, of course. But I think one of the most significant incorporations in The Woman in the World is the representation also of survivor-led activism through the character of Neve, yeah, who is this woman you have on the left in the picture of there. We get to know a group of women who are campaigning for justice and recognition. And I think they're somehow paralleling the real world efforts of organizations like Justice for Magdalenes, definitely. In the story, there's lots of Gothic elements, like, for example, the fact that along with some retrospective scenes about Lorna's incarceration in the laundry, where the horror was somehow externally executed by the nuns, yeah, and it was quite visible, quite systemic. I think in this production, what we have is that her house, her home, it acquires major camera attention, and it's a totally, quite haunted and, quite oppressive space. By using Gothic tropes, we have a lot of creaking floorboards, we have scratching of the walls, we have shadows all over the episodes, right? I think Murtagh is suggesting that for survivors, trauma is not a memory, but a persistent physical presence every day that occupies their private lives. Similarly, Lorna suffers from extreme dissociation and sleepwalking, and so she's an unreliable narrator, which forces the audience to experience with her a fractured reality. You're never quite sure if what she sees, whether they are ghostly figures or whatever, is a supernatural haunting or it's an hallucination. And of course, this is quite similar to what happens to the disorientation felt by people with post-traumatic syndrome. Also, Lorna's body is possessed by her trauma, and in the many sleepwalking episodes, and she performs also actions that she cannot remember, and she sometimes harms herself. This Gothic portrayal highlights how trauma robs the former Magdalene women some kind of corporeal agency. So she's not like, she's not in control of her body. So this makes them feel like a stranger in their own skin, yeah, as some women have actually affirmed in their testimonies. The Gothic element of the return of the repressed is also central. And the wall in Lorna's house functions as a literal and also a metaphorical tomb for the secrets. Yeah, in Gothic tradition, things that are buried alive, whether they are people, memories, or whatever, always come back to the surface. And this turns the historical mystery into a ghost story, where the gods are the thousands of children lost to the system, and also those people who, like the the nun, yeah, who contributed to keep it going, and of course all the Magdalene women that return and return, right? So, as previous productions about the Laundries and Modern Baby Homes, a woman in the world tries to make viewers witness the injustices, of course. But I think the addition of the Gothic genre engages us in feeling the terror and the madness of a life haunted by a past that is not resolved and also not acknowledged. So, as Murtagh himself has mentioned in an interview, he tries, quote, to shed some light on the awful things that occurred within these kind of institutions and introduce this history to the wider public so that nothing like it may ever happen again. To cast the net wide and get the story out there to as wide an audience as possible. It is still affecting quite a lot of people, and there must be thousands more who don't even know what they've been affected, that they have been affected by it. So to conclude, Magdalene Noir represents a crucial evolution in Irish history, this and literature. These narratives serve as significant tools to dismantle the rule of silence that protected the Laundries for decades. They transform institutional secrets into public narratives, forcing a more direct confrontation with the traumatic effects of the nation's architecture of containment. Christian Falls, Even the Dead, The Woman in the Wall make visible the continuum of abuse that characterized the Irish social order, not only in the mid-20th century, but up to the present times, when the impunity of the ruling class that sustained them has not been fully redressed and the victim's dignity has not been sufficiently restored. Banville and Murtagh's critical stance locate the reader, I think, in what Sarah Ames calls an affective intensity, suggesting the circulation of Magdalene trauma and affects towards it across novels, across productions, and across time. The detectives, the survivors, or the activists, unfortunately, cannot bring the charge to a traditional court. However, the narratives provide a form of social justice by exposing the truth to the public consciousness. They offer some kind of a reckoning, that official reports often fail to provide because of political or legal constraints. Somehow they become a form of, transitional justice, exposing the system and the complicity of the religious orders, the secular allies, and the legal system in the trafficking of children and the abuse of women. So by rendering these hidden traumas visible through a very gritty lens, Irish Magdalene Noir keeps the demand for historical accountability alive in our public consciousness, ensuring that the suffering of survivors is recognized as a structural failure rather than an isolated series of tragedies. They merge the troubling history of the island with the impact of the thriller, so these texts ensure that the victims are not forgotten. They become a reminder that the structural dimension of evil is not a relic of the past, but a force that requires constant interrogation to ensure that the path to reparation remains open. Thank you.